Salam, this is Ramala Hubb'Allah, and we're back to the next part of my talk on the possible future of countries in the time of climate shift. In my view, this could be a possibility, right? I'm not saying this is how things are definitely going to happen, but this is how they could turn out. I was previously talking about how I have, after some contemplation and understanding and looking at things, renamed what is called climate change, which seemed to have a linear narrative of all things sort of going in a decline in planetary heating, to climate shift. And I was talking about the differentials between the West and the rest of the poles, like the rest of the world, South and East in particular, which is really coming up and organizing at this time and moving towards their own development because they've been so underdeveloped for so long. But I mentioned that they cannot take any longer the path that the West took towards development because one, those resources have been exhausted, the politics has changed, the scenario is different. So the West's path towards development, which was the military industrial pharmaceuticals, I call them, path, is under revision and correction. And so the rest of the world, as we call them, will have to take a different path. And hopefully that path is ecological, uh, focused on fundamental, fundamental and agreed upon good. The world isn't there yet, but it's going to move here. Actually, the ecological minded world, ecological, spiritual, ecological world is already there. So, yeah, they're like there. It is the political and socio-economic world that is catching up still, right? But most of human beings lie in this domain, waiting for their politicians to take actions, even though that is actually changing with social media, as people are saying, there's another way of life. Why don't we just leapfrog to it? Leapfrog to it. That, I think, would be the answer. It's when the people wake up and they organize, that'll be the answer. So I've just jumped to the conclusion here. Let's come back to climate change versus climate shift. So climate change has a narrative, and that is not so wrong, even though there are different ways of looking at it, that the world is in a state of decline, it is heating. The only thing that I want to add when I talk about climate shift is that not all the world, all places, all at once are declining the same, or are equally responsible, right? So not everybody has to suffer alike or adjust alike. Because if we talk about climate change and we say, oh, we got to shift our way of life, the thing is that there are people who are already living below poverty line. They don't have any more to give. They only have to gain. So when they start gaining, they cannot, no matter what is happening to the planet, take the stance that we got to simplify our life even more. We got to give things up. They never had things to begin with. They're just still living in undercultivated land, unstructured places. Like literally, I live in a place, I live in the Himalayas, and so much here is so unstructured. Let me give you a look. All right, so this is a view from my window, and even though I live actually in a town which is very structured, but just look at this woodwork workshop here, and it's so basic. Now I wouldn't say primitive, but it's still pretty basic. They are making good stuff here, which is going to be used for restaurants. And not until so long ago, they were just like doing basic stuff. Now they have demand from restaurants and hotels, which are springing up in the Himalayan region. So like they're making all these good doors and stuff. Otherwise, people would just hack together something with their hands and just hang like a weird door on the entrance to their house. And I've lived in houses like this, which just had like it was just like a shack, right? And people are still making those, by the way. So this is what the world is like. This is the Himalayas, very beautiful, right? This is a view from my window, by the way. really sunny, really beautiful right now. We've been getting double rainbows every now and then. Very recently, one after the other, so it's beautiful. It's very unstructured. So look at the state of the road here. Right, most roads are like this. So that's that. And we often don't even have electricity here. So if you don't have electricity here, and if your road looks like just a gravel path, what more could you do? What adjustment could you make? You're already very primitive. There are some dangerous developments here, such as cement construction, which is taking over the indigenous natural homes that were once the way of life, and they were climate adaptive. But we no longer have that. So actually, there isn't much that some parts of the world can give. They are adapting to a different and, in my view, dangerous to them way of life because of how the population is actually up-leveling itself and their needs are not being met, right? So I'm going to put this aside. Needs of developing world's populations not being met. This is the issue that we'll talk about maybe in this talk or some of the time. So climate change narrative that is emerging from the West is like the planet is heating. We all need to sort of like scale down our way of life, but how scale down would most of the people of the world would go who are already living in slums and such. And in fact, even in the West, as I said in the previous part of my the same talk, the same lecture, even in the most developed nations, there are some people who have a lot of resources, like billions and even trillions of dollars, and there are lots of people who have very little resources. The state isn't even a welfare state. There isn't a proper distribution of wealth. So we are looking at a problem. And that problem exists even in the West, which was so far just automatically deemed like the epitome of development. People aspire towards it. I, as somebody who has been focusing on people's issues, who has been reading the news and, just watching and observing different societies and looking at the breakdown of societies. And obviously, we get a lot of news from the West. Like, we're not West obsessed or anti-West or something. It is just that the way information is distributed in the world, we get a lot of information from the West. So if people from the West are like, why are people always talking about us? Well, this is because you're very, very well distributed. And your media and your politicians and your industry make sure that it gets known around the world. So it's no wonder that people know a lot about you. We know more about what goes on in the streets of New York than literally what goes on in our own backyards, because we don't get information from our part of the world. You're not to be blamed for it. In fact, we should be making better effort to have our own media, which is something that started happening about like a decade and a half ago in a really, or about a couple of decades ago in a really massive sense, when regional media started springing up. And for example, Muslims came up with Al Jazeera and they're like, we need our own voice post 9/11, right? So there have been concurrent developments happening which are balancing out the world's polarities, various polarities. I erased that subject line from the top of this board, but I had a line here, non-gendered polarities. I'm going to put that back because everything ties back to that. All these lectures that I'm giving are actually tying back to that bigger lecture, which is about non-gendered polarities and their impact, gendered, and their impact upon planet and the people. Polarities, right? So for me, basically, all right, for me, this is how I write with my left hand. I could write better if I wasn't holding the camera with my hand. For me, I'll just cut down to the stage now. For me, reframing the issue of climate change, climate shift, is what makes it more ecological, right? So it isn't like the planet is on a linear path from better to worse, or worse to better, or cool to hot, or hot to cool, whatever you want to say, right? Or better to worse, worse to better, because there are people arguing on all sides of the equation. What I've said, okay, one way to resolve this whole conflict of who's seeing what, and for pretty valid reasons if you think about it, because there are people who I came to understand are actually not experiencing a decline. They really aren't. Either they don't understand science, or they're not getting data enough, or they are getting used to the shifts that are happening, or they're seeing those shifts as some kind of natural part of life and they don't know that things are just getting better. Though now there's like a rising voice amongst people, as we can see in US, etc. The people are saying, no, man, I mean, like, we are on a path of decline. We can't just suppose that we are a developed nation. We are being screwed. So the politicians are saying that. Western politicians everywhere, far right is, and the conservatives and nationalists have sprung up because they are able to articulate very uncomfortable truths. I was just sitting and watching. I was like, when is the West actually going to state the obvious that uh, they are getting taxed now? And I think a lot of people wouldn't say it because not articulating that meant that the world had access to the generous resources of the West, while the rest of the world, as I would call it, is not so developed. It doesn't have its issues sorted out. Some of the issues are really primitive, such as the rights of women and the youth. So what the world does it, rest of the world. The easy peasy path is just to go west or try to obtain help or resources from the West living where you are. And I know there are some reparations needed, and I know that the West has colonized us. I know that the West is plundering some resources, etc. But the fact is that our moral courage and our outlook on life cannot, in my view and in my statement and understanding, rest upon taking things back from somebody. When we have natural resources at our disposal, at our land still, which we can utilize, even without changing anything politically, by using our minds, resources, and labor to make good of what we have right now. And that is going to start building our strengths such that we are able to build our negotiating power and even make the colonials retreat. Isn't that a plan? Right? I've summed up a huge, huge matter in just a few words. Let's just come back to this climate change versus climate shift issue, which is very closely tied to political understanding of the world. So you will now understand why am I getting into all these lectures? Why is this important and needed? I wish I talked about this earlier. I probably kind of didn't want to alarm the people of the world because it was kind of like putting your hand in the wasp's nest by telling people that, you know what, the West is not going to take this anymore. This is what's happening right now. The West is like, wait a second, enough. Like, we can't keep on giving. Even if we are colonizers, we just cannot keep on stuffing people into our countries and handing things out to them. We've got to stop and stop our intakes and expansion and our giving and our engagements and even our wars and whatever, our interference in other people's countries. At this point, we need to center ourselves. Then we're going to take it from there. And I think this is A-okay. Even though it's hard, it's going to be really hard for the rest of the world, which I'm a part of. I live here. I haven't chosen to go to the West, and I'm like, let's rough it out over here. Let's show what we are made of. This is going to become very challenging and interesting. Coming back to climate change versus climate shift, what I am understanding, what's happening at a biological level, or not just a level of our understanding or our narratives, is that one, I believe the planet could decidedly be, affirmatively be, positively be heating up. We'll talk about that later. Why or how, all right? I think that is because the planet is choked. The planet's systems are choked. And now what is also happening is that energetics are shifting. When there are migrations happening, population moving about, resources going from here and there, that is seriously going to change the temperature of the world. And when human beings move, when resources move, uh, our human activity affects microclimates. So microclimates start adjusting themselves, which means that wind patterns, air patterns, water flow patterns are going to start changing. Also, we are acidifying oceans in some places. We are changing the pH level of oceans and water, which means water is going to start traveling into other directions. Wind is going to start changing into other directions. So basically, since it is a finite and circular planet, basically what is happening is that elements are just traveling in this petri dish, right? They go from here to there, and where are they going? What is going to be the end model or end game? I actually don't think it's an end game because people and resources are in constant movement. I do believe that it could be that some forces try to create a lockdown in order to freeze the whole thing, but it could not be frozen because guess what? Humans are living thinking beings, living thinking beings. We're not going to freeze. We're going to react. We're going to keep on moving. So, whoever the decision makers are, they have to come up with a dynamic model. There is no lockdown. No lockdown, no end game. No singular end game, I should say. No singular end game. There are multiple end games. Yeah, there's no, continuing from the previous video, there's no lockdown, no freeze mode, no single end game. I was writing multiple end games. Multiple and concurrent end games that take place simultaneously. Each player is playing for their own selves. So we're like, oops, now we have billions of players in terms of individual people. So we can look at players in terms of nations. And then you're like, well, if a nation has a head of state like called Putin or Trump, they don't decide for everybody. So literally, it all just comes down to basically households, which is a good unit of decision making because household tends to go in tandem, or a person. That is a unit of decision making that we need to focus on, right, and deal with. And so, in order to understand or make sense of this moving data, we have to look at household and person and what they're doing. And you know what? We can never understand them in a freeze frame. We can never stop the whole world and say, well, I'm trying to get a picture of it. We tried to do that. It didn't work. There were masks versus no masks, inside versus outside. It's healthier to be inside versus it's healthier to be outside. Pretty much both sides were okay because while it is normally obviously okay and better to be outside and gain your health, if there really is like a radical threat outside, then you need to be inside, which on the longer term, even in like a short long term, is not okay. So you basically cannot put the world in a freeze mode. But this is how some people and decision makers think because they cannot deal with a dynamic model of life. Like they're like, no, we can't deal with dynamic models. We need an end game. What is the end game? What is the end picture? Answer: there is none. There is no end game. Perhaps there's no end game. There is just the continuous game. They're just gaming and playing. So we need to focus on household and persons. And instead of trying to get like a frozen picture of them, how about we tell them how to behave in order to have an optimal planet where we are doing fundamentally agreed upon good things? Like those things are going to have a good outcome. And then you say, well, if people behave in such a particular manner and did that or this, the outcome would tend towards fundamental agreed upon good. And if they cross those limits, then we have penalties. Which, of course, in my view, are not immediately applied, but you just give them a warning. You have a structure for delivering penalties, from a warning to sort of like soft warning, etc. And then finally, what in Muslim teachings is called a had. Had is an Arabic word, it's meaning limit. That's it. You've reached the boundary. This is when the strictest of Islamic punishments are given, which a lot of people think are given to you in first, time you break a limit. Not really. First of all, human beings are supposed to set up a society. That in itself takes a lot of work. A society is not set up through controlling and dictating people into it. Societies are created through agreements. When people have given the agreement, they've given their word, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, they're not very likely to cross the boundaries. So if they do cross the boundaries, HUD sometimes is immediately imposed because they, instead of people being warned as they exit the system, warnings as they exit the system as if they were like uncultured animals. Even animals are trained by their parents, right? So that's what I'm saying, cultured animals. We have a system of bringing people into the fold through agreements. That's the beauty of it. You agreed to enter the system, tuck, 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 tuck. So if you're found outside the system, you have, of your own accord, violated certain parameters. And outside of those parameters, you are then dealt with. So that is that. I'm going to clean the board now and get back to talking about a little bit more on the SID matter. Thank you.